Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
All right, I'm counting us into the episode here in 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today, actually about to embark on an episode I've been wanting to do for a long time because I like the people that I see on the screen in front of me. Some of you may remember from way back in the day. Ryan, I guess you've been on the show twice. You and I did an episode about, we did an episode about Jackie Robinson and the integration of baseball, and then you joined us for an episode that we did about what if there had been no Star Wars. So for those of you that may remember Ryan Cole, Ryan's back with us now. By the way, Ryan is now newly minted. Go ahead and give your joke, Ryan. You graduated on Saturday, but it's not your first graduation, right?
No, I also have, so I got a bachelor's in civil engineering, and I also have a bachelor's in music and a master's in music. So is this an interrogation? Because I'm getting the third degree.
I will actually find the rim shot noise to insert at that point there in the post edit. So for those of you that hear the rim shot, if it actually happens there, it may be me on a different channel doing the rim shot with my mouth before it's all said and done, but I'll try to include a rim shot there. But good to have you back, Ryan. And I enjoyed both of those episodes. I've known Ryan, I guess, for basically all of his life. So
yeah, pretty much.
So it's good to have him here. But I'm also really excited about having Ryan's dad, Kenny, on the screen here. Kenny and I go way back as well. Kenny, say hi to the good folks.
Hey, glad to be here. Really enjoyed the podcast. And yeah, me and Don go back, 30 some odd years.
some number of years.
Yeah, 30 some odd.
Yeah, you may have heard actually Alexis a couple of times make reference to Mr. Kenny or other things we may have talked about in episodes. This is the Kenny that she's talking about, and their family are good friends of ours, and we feel very close to. We share a common affliction, affection, something or other. I know as I'm looking here, we can see this on screen. I'm wearing a cap favoring a particular baseball team that's found here. I see that Kenny's wearing that. I know that Ryan is a fan of this. He's wearing, there you go.
It's a baseball shirt.
The baseball shirt. Kenny and I are cursed with being Astros fans. And for most of our life, that meant being cursed. Lately, it's been being some success, but still being somewhat cursed because even our one success is somewhat cursed. But baseball, among other things, or topics in history, are things that Kenny and I have talked about for decades. And so the idea of having him on an alternate history podcast talking about baseball just seems like the most natural thing I can imagine doing in the entire world. And Ryan gets his baseball love genetically, but he's also a much later comer to the sport in some ways, and also looks at it analytically, which I know is one of the fun things that I enjoy. Ryan is a sabermetrician. If you know what that is, you know what it is. If you don't, I'm not going to take the time to try to explain it because there's no point in trying to do it. But today our historical what if is going to be, it's sort of timely and it's sort of not. It's timely in the sense of there's something going on in the real world now that relates to this. And at the same time, it goes back a pretty good distance. Right now, we have entered into a work stoppage in Major League Baseball. I guess right now it's in the form of an owner's lockout, I guess is technically what it is, if I understand correctly at this point. The collective bargaining agreement, the relationship between the owners and the players, that agreement has expired. So they're in limbo right now about what happens with Major League Baseball. By the way, that's a U.S. thing for those of you that are global listeners. Think of cricket with lines. That's a good way maybe to think about it. We can go on from there. And they're not allowed to carry the bats when they run. That's another difference between those two sports for those of you that know both sports. But the last time Major League Baseball had a work stoppage was 1994. And as I was setting up and thinking about this episode, that's actually further back than it ought to be, because I remember that as an adult, which means I must be getting to be a much older adult at this time. So this is 94 to 2001. Dare that be 27 years ago?
Indeed.
that Major League Baseball had a work stoppage. So today we're going to go down the historical what if. Of course, we'll talk about the what did because we have to do that and burn some time doing it. That's what we do here on A Fork in Time. But we'll talk about the historical what did of the 1994 Major League Baseball strike. But of course, looking at the alternate history, we're going to talk about what if there had not been a work stoppage or a strike in 1994. And I think that takes us to some interesting places in the short term and potentially in the long term for the sport. So if you're a baseball fan, I presume you will be back after the break because you're intrigued and you're a baseball fan. If you're not, at least come back after the break and give it a shot. You don't have to stick through to the very end. We don't take off points if you don't stick to the very end. But I think we will go to things.
I won't tell any more jokes.
Well, we may need jokes at the rate we're going when we come back too. But I think we'll see that there are potential implications of this that fall outside of the sport proper too. And some of the things that I've thought about there. So it won't just be, it'll be a lot of baseball. Spoiler alert, fair warning. So if this is not for you, we'll have another episode next week and we welcome you back. But even if you're not, stick with it because I think you'll find some interesting things there. So we'll be right back after this break.
Hi, it's Don.
And Alexis, I'm here too.
Taking a quick break from the podcast, really to just reach out and something we normally do at sort of at the end of a lot of episodes. What do we normally encourage people to do at the end of our episodes, Lex?
Give us suggestions.
Give us suggestions and do other things for us to interact with us. And the best place to do that is it's our little corner, quaint little corner, not overly decorated and not overly ornate, but still corner of the internet. And where will folks find that at?
It's a forkintimepodcast.com. Like we say, the A is important. The podcast is important to get to the right place.
Yeah, and so among the things that you can find at a forkintime.com
podcast,
see, it is important, is that you can find links to our previous shows. You can find but a number of different ways to give us feedback. So we have comment forms, and we read and we digest those, and we've made changes to the show. But there's also topic suggestions there. And so one of the things that we want to encourage our listeners to do is what, Lex?
Is to give us those suggestions. Go to that website.
Yeah, here's the deal. I know because I get to see the statistics, we've talked often about the statistics, that a lot of the episodes that we do that are focused on a particular part of the world, I won't say which, but Alexis knows which one it is, because those get good listenership. I think a lot of our listeners like us to go there, but we also understand that sometimes we can go to the same places or the same time frames too often.
Yep.
And one of the ways that we know to diversify the content of the show is to diversify the content outside of my head and Alexis's head, and then some of the contributors that have been on with some frequency and some regularity that you've gotten to know. So we need your help. If there's a part of history that you think is being drastically overlooked that has all types of interesting what-if twists, don't leave it to us to find that. What do you need to do, Lex?
You need to go submit it in the website.
Yeah, please do. And detailed there, I normally interact with folks once they've submitted suggestions. In fact, that's how a number of the folks who have joined the podcast have come on the podcast, because not only did they have good ideas, but they were ready to articulate those ideas, and we welcome that. So we just wanted to take a brief moment here to encourage you to check out www.aforkintimepodcast.com and find the resources that are there. During this time where we're still endeavoring through the global pandemic, we still have our COVID check-in. We still want to hear from you there, and just the other ways that we invite you to interact as well.
Even if you already checked in with us, check in again. It's been months.
Yeah, we would appreciate that. So again, what we're pitching here is we're pitching ourselves, but we're mainly pitching the website. So one last time for the listeners, Lex, where is that going to be?
aforkintimepodcast.com.
Check it out.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. I am joined by a couple of Coles. Ryan and Kenny are their names. Introduced them there before the break, and we're going to talk about the 1994 Major League Baseball strike, and our historical what if will be what if there were not a strike, but we always have to sort of set up the historical what did. So Kenny, there's never been any labor strife or any disagreements between the players and the owners in the history of baseball. It's basically just a story of perfect universal peace and harmony, right?
Nothing could be further from the truth. Since the beginning of the very first time guys were getting paid, there was the beginning of some of the new leagues in baseball started because of a labor problem. There were some defunct leagues that started early in baseball because of labor, the players wanting more cut of the pie But the owners were able to hold a pretty firm grip on them, pretty much, even though there was strife. And I mean, even the Sandy Koufax and Don Drysdale staged a little mini strike themselves in the 60s. But I think that like 1972 is the first real one, and you may probably not remember that one much. But there was 86 games, and they had a little work stoppage in 72, and basically it's always come down to the free agency, and once that became a thing, the owners wanting to limit it and the players wanting to expand it, and that's kind of what they fought over, and that's pretty general, but that's kind of the way I always see it.
Yeah, and actually the period of time I mentioned, it's been 27 years since the last work stoppage. That's been like the longest period of labor peace basically in the history of baseball. It's gone through some near misses and some things that almost happened, but 27 years is a long time. It's an unprecedented long time in Major League Baseball to not have either an actual stoppage, or not have some interruption, or the very imminent serious threat that there was going to be a strike or a lockout or something like that.
Right. I know you remember in 81 when in 81 when they lost 713 games and had the split season. And see, then that lasted till 94. And so and that seemed like a long time. So to go from there to here has been really, a lot of baseball fans, grow up are not used to this. Like I said, we kind of been, and it seems like there was always on the horizon, even when you wasn't going through it, you're worrying about it. I looked it up. I said even 73 and 76 and 80, they had some stoppages, but there was no games lost. They seemed to resolve it before they would actually lose any games. And,
so setting the context for baseball is this has been an ongoing thing in baseball.
Yeah.
Which I think it's important to grasp. And, one of my favorite documentary makers, Ken Burns, American documentary maker, he has made a lot of great documentaries. I think most people know him for at least I know him or think about him for two particular documentaries. Although recently his country music and his Vietnam documentaries, I think
I've seen them both.
Are well worth. But he did, of course, the Civil War. That was his big claim to fame. And then he did the very extended baseball documentary. The interesting thing about that was it's about the time of this work stoppage. So the way that sort of played together is also unique there. But one of the things I remember about particularly his baseball documentary, and again, because of his Civil War documentary and his longstanding interest in civil rights, is that he sort of tells the story of the history of baseball, which is rife with all kinds of characters, any type of character you can imagine. But he tells it through two primary lenses. This sort of goes back to the episode that Ryan and I did, the lens of desegregating, integrating the game in with Jackie Robinson's arrival in 1947. And then also the later part of his documentary, he's talking about Curt Flood and others who were challenging this economic system, how players and owners interacted. And, the analogy that Curt Flood, who was one of the players who chose to break what's called the reserve system, we probably won't get into all the detail of that. I'll throw some links in the show notes for those of you that are just wonky enough to want to know what the reserve clause was all about if you don't. But Flood challenged the system for free agency. Actually, he wasn't one of the first ones to actually even enjoy it. It took court cases. But this idea of what most of us enjoy as Americans, and frankly, everywhere else in the world, of if you want to go get a new job tomorrow, you just go get a new job, right? You can quit and you can go wherever you want to go and work. Not so in Major League Baseball, because you sign contracts and teams own your rights. It's a different environment. And so that's a lot of what was leading up to the 94 work stoppage, without getting into all the elements that there, but they were striking over the free agency rights had already been won. But now, as Kenny pointed out, it's about how to divide the pie. Who should get the money? The players who produce the product, or the owners who take the risk? And so, Ron, is there anything about the 94 work situation you want to mention here? Just we're talking about the what did. Don't want to dwell too much on the what did before we jump to the what if.
Right. From my understanding, a lot of it also had to do with revenue sharing. because some of the smaller clubs, and particularly the Expos, which I think we should talk about some at some point.
Right.
A lot of the smaller clubs were really struggling to, compete with the larger budget clubs, and they wanted some form of revenue sharing, and they couldn't come to an agreement with that. And there was also tied into that the idea of the salary cap, which obviously the Players Association was very much against. So in addition to some of the free agency stuff, both that salary cap and the idea of the revenue sharing were also both pretty big issues going into the strike.
Right. And again, it was a strike. The players chose the leverage of in the middle of the season. This was actually in August. This is a pretty substantial way through the season of interrupting play. And we'll talk about sort of where things stood, because you're right. We have to talk about the Expos because they're representative of that season, but they're also representative of a lot was going on in baseball, both before and after that, because we're talking about, by the way, a Major League Baseball team that played in Canada in the city of Montreal. I say that because there are people that are alive that are listening to this episode that may not realize there was a Major League Baseball club in Montreal, because that team has found its way now to the Washington, D.C. area, and we call them the Nationals. But they were actually called, that was the first time I remember seeing something that made me realize I needed to learn how to convert feet to meters. When I actually saw the markings on the wall in Olympic Stadium about, what the distance was there, and got to hear the Canadian national anthem and got to hear announcements in French, of all things, at baseball games when you watch them on TV. It was, by the way, an orange roof. I'm stream of consciousness going on here with the Expos now in my head. They had a stadium that wasn't a dome that became a dome, that the dome was orange, but that's a whole other thing that goes into that. So the strike
it was supposed to be retractable too. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah.
The top had a crane that was supposed to lift the roof off, and I don't think it was ever functional. But it was not a good place to play, which is part of their problem, or go watch a game either. It was a part of their problem.
Right.
Also back to the owners, and like we're touching on what Ryan was saying, it wasn't just players against owners. It was players against owners, and then owners, large market owners against small market owners. Some of the large market owners would kind of fine with the system the way it was. But it was the small market peak guys who felt like, and then they, like I said, revenue sharing. How are you going to revenue share? Some of the larger markets said, well, we need to put a minimum in if we're going to make the. So it was really, and it's also ended up where the owners finally got rid of the charade of having an impartial commissioner, and they just hired one of their own to be a commissioner, and that didn't go well either, in my opinion.
Those are all excellent points. Is that you want to think about this as being a binary thing, owners versus players, but certainly, as you mentioned, it was small market, quote unquote small market versus large market teams that could generate revenue because of the markets they were in that other teams had no hope whatsoever of generating revenue. First of all, we should just establish this. This is a fact. This is not opinion. We don't do opinion here on Fork in Time, except for the speculative part. We're still in the what did. This is fact. The Yankees are evil, and they're an empire, and they represented, and still do to a great degree, represent an entirely different way economically of looking at baseball than, for example, the club we're going to spend some time talking about, because 94 was a pivotal year for me. This team from Montreal, which was arguably the best team in baseball that year. They had the best record. A lot of good reasons to believe they had an excellent chance of being the champion of the World Series that year. But the economics of playing in Montreal were very different than the economics of playing in New York or Los Angeles, or even where all of us happen to be from, Houston, which is not a small town, but not quite the media market that a New York or an LA would be. So you don't think of Houston as being a small market team, but is Houston a large market team, even historically down to this day? The answer probably is no, in the classic sense of the way that the economics of baseball worked back during that period of time. So we end up with a strike that happens in August, and they don't get it settled. It's not until the following year that baseball resumes. And so some things happened in 1994 that hadn't happened for 90 plus years. One of them is there's no world champion crowned in the case of a winner of the World Series. There's no playoffs. There'd already been an all-star game, so that happens. But there's a year that has a season that ends up not being a season. So that was unusual. And one of the things that definitely happened, and we're going to talk about this, I think it's one thing you have to talk about, is the alienation aspect of fans as a result of this experience, and how that alters and what maybe would be different had there not been a work stoppage. So I don't want to dwell too much on the what did. We talked about there'd been this contentious system, lots of powers and factions. Even inside the players, there are these superstar free agent players who are able to go out and command tremendously large salaries. And then there's journeyman major leaguers who get called up occasionally, maybe the term is a cup of coffee, as often as how it's described, that don't ever, they make okay money. The major league minimum, not a bad salary, but, having spent 6-7 years in the minor leagues making nothing, that type of thing, it doesn't pay off quite the same way. So you can argue there's disparity between the owners and there's disparity between the players and what they represent and what the system ought to be. So imagining where things stood at the end of the 1994 season, I did not pull it up here. I need to do it now. I mentioned the Expos. Who were some of the other good teams that year in 1994?
Well, this will be a shock to you, but the Yankees were very good that year.
The Houston Astros were a half game out of first.
Behind the Cincinnati Reds.
Behind the Cincinnati Reds, so they were pretty good. And
of course, Yankees. The Atlanta Braves. The '90s powerhouse teams that they had. I believe '94 was actually the only season in the '90s where the Braves did not win their division. And it's due to the aforementioned Montreal Expos, who had a 6-game lead on them at the time of the work stoppage.
Yeah, and the interesting thing, there are a couple of things just to reference here that I had forgotten until we were doing the research for this. I was born in 1968. In 1968, there were two leagues, the National League and the American League. The National League was about to go through, there's about to be expansion in both leagues over the next few years. Prior to that expansion in 69, there weren't divisions. There was one league. And so for those of you that are international sports fans, think the English Premier League. There's 1 through 20. Or think of other things like that where there's not, there's one champion that's the leading team with standings in their league. That's how you determine it. In baseball, the American League and the National League were two separate leagues, but their champions were determined by who had the best record in those two leagues. Those two teams went directly on to compete with each other in the World Series. There's no intervening round of playoffs. In 1969, there's expansion. And for the first time, we go into a divisional system in each of the two leagues. And in that case, there's 6 teams initially in each league's divisions. Those two teams will now play each other in this thing called a playoff series in baseball, which had never happened before. Right. And then the winner of that series would face off in the World Series. That's baseball that I knew growing up as a kid. When I first became aware of it, was that you had an East and a West division in the National League and the American League. But something new had happened by 1994. That had been additional expansion. And how many divisions were there all of a sudden in 1994?
We had 6. Because in 1993, the Florida Marlins and Colorado Rockies were added. And so you had 14 teams in each league, correct?
You had 14 in, that is correct. And so you had 2 5-team divisions and 1 4-team division in each league.
Right.
And so suddenly you had this thing, you still had a West and an East division in this league, but suddenly there was a Central. And for those of you that are familiar with American geography, and even those of you that aren't, believe it or not, a team from Atlanta prior to this played in the Western Division, even though there were at least 4 teams that were further west on the map than them. Arguably, probably Cincinnati, St. Louis, Chicago at a minimum were all further to the west. But yet the Braves were in the West. But when they realigned, the Braves moved from the West to the East. And our hometown team, the Astros, who had been in the National League West, joined this new thing called the National League
Central.
And so where we find the standings on the date of the strike in 1994 is there are 3 divisions. And oh, by the way, it doesn't work really well with this playoff system to have 6 teams, unless you're going to have one team get a bye and wait. So they had created this thing called the wild card, which is found in other sports as well. So that was also going to be the first year of the wild card. And so if I remember correctly, you were mentioning there, Kenny, that the Astros were not in first place. They trailed the Cincinnati Reds in the Central by half a game. But I think they would have been at that point. They were holding on to the wild card spot, if my memory serves. I may be wrong on that once I actually pull up.
No, yeah, they had the 3rd best record in the National League.
Okay.
So yeah, they would have been the wild card.
And as Ryan was pointing out there, the Braves were starting their dominance in the 90s, but they had been dominant in the West, and now they're being dominant in the East. But Montreal existed in the National League East. And they were hands down. They had won 70 games by that point in the season, and that was much ahead of almost everyone else. Here, I'm finally going to have it in front of me now. So
but the Expos were at 74 and 40.
74 and 40.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
So they are well on their way to.
Did you check out the American League Central, by the way?
I'm there now, so I can do it.
I believe the Rangers are leading with a losing record.
Well, that was the West, AL West.
That's AL. They were in the West.
Yeah, they were in the West.
Yeah, I'll say a bit about the AL West because I think this does get into some things with the playoff impact. So not only were the Rangers leading the AL West with the losing record, they were 10 games under 500.
They were 52 and 62.
Yes. So a 456 winning percentage, leading their division. And not only that, but all of the other 10 teams in the American League had a better record than that. So the last place teams of the AL East and the AL Central had a better record than the first place Texas Rangers. And given that this was the first year of this new divisional alignment, if this had gone through to a full season, I think there would have been a lot of upset fans that, teams that won 90 or 95 games but ended up second were locked out of the playoffs. Even with the wild card, you could see this happening, whereas, a sub 500 team was going to make their way in. So that this isn't one of those really impressive, I guess, kind of what ifs to think about, but it is interesting to note that the AL West was bad. And there's a morbid curiosity about how bad of a team could have gotten into the playoffs that year.
Certainly a sub 500 team could have made it into the playoffs. The assumption is they probably would have become a winning team by a small margin just because of, just the way that tends to work out over time. You play a lot of divisional foes in the way the schedule was sort of balanced.
You only had how many games they have left?
They didn't have a lot left. They were 104 games into a 162 game season. Yeah. So there's 48 games left, and you've got to make up 10 games to 500. So you got to go at a pretty good clip just to make it back to 500 at that point.
Right.
Yeah, and the Yankees were a good team there. They were 70 and 43 and leading the National League East. But again, the real story sort of that year, as I remember it from baseball, was the Expos.
Yeah.
And the Expos had good teams before. They had teams that had made the playoffs, I guess, in the strike shortened year of 81, if 81. I remember serves.
Yeah.
And they had teams that had competed before in the old National League East, but they were 74 and 40, were ahead of the Braves, who were, again, this was the juggernaut Braves of the 90s, in some of their early incarnation. They were a full 6 games up on the Atlanta Braves. And you're right, Kenny. I guess technically the Braves would have been the wild card team at that point. As I look here, the Astros were 66 and 49, trailing the Reds in the Central by half a game. And so things come to a stop. So again, we're talking about the what if here. So portraying that out, Ryan's already hit upon one of the things that you may have had a representative in the American League playoffs that was a team that didn't even make 500. You had some good teams in other divisions, and you had this format that was going to happen that had never happened except in a strike shortened year of an additional playoff round. So what's the first things that pops in your mind about that different format in 1994, assuming that we carry it all the way to the postseason because there's no strike?
You want to take this one?
No, go ahead.
I actually don't have a lot of notes about the playoff impact, aside from kind of what I already talked about. You know, I'm sure that's something that the owners wanted, was these expanded playoffs. So I think they were really anxious to kind of see how that went. You know, relating that to what's going on right now, that's something that we hear about a lot, that the owners really want to expand and have 14 or 16 teams, you know, half the league getting into the postseason. Which, you know, the nature of baseball is you prove your worth and you prove your salt over a long season, not in a 5 or 7 game series. So I'm not a big fan of that, but
that's made for television. That's what and made for
right.
You know. Well, I was looking back over this. I was surprised this was the first year of the 3 divisions. I didn't remember that. I guess because maybe the strike, and so you know I didn't really got to the part where I was talking about how would that have played out, and in the if there'd been the playoffs. I guess let's see, that would have been. So the Braves were edging out the Astros.
If you assume that the relative position in the standings carries through to the end of the year,
and especially given Bagwell's fractured wrist,
right? Which we'll come back to, because that's a closer to home thing for us. But yeah.
So you'd had the Expos playing the Reds, and then the Rangers losing to the Braves. would that have been the first round?
I think the way
that's American League.
Yeah, the Dodgers would have faced off with the Expos. The Braves and the Reds would have played each other.
That's right.
And the assumption there, I think,
the Dodgers' record wasn't that great.
No, they were 2 games over 500. Both of the West divisions were not good, and they were also made uniquely what they were by the fact that they were both 14 divisions. So that was part of what, later the balancing out and interleague play and other stuff that's going to has to come along to sort of fix some of that. But
maybe we can say this about the playoffs and use it to excuse me, kind of segue into the Expos is, as you've kind of mentioned, I think they were the clear favorites. They were a juggernaut team that year. They had 5 All-Stars, and that doesn't include the young Pedro Martinez.
And we're talking about a very young future Hall of Famer, Pedro Martinez.
Yes. But they, they were 6 games ahead of the Braves, who were a great team. And even in their head-to-head matches, the Expos had done very well. So you imagine the biggest competition probably would have been the Yankees. In that scenario, but it's hard to bet against the Expos and what they had. And so you've kind of mentioned this before too, Don, that one of the interesting things about the Expos is they play in Montreal. We think so much about baseball being American, being a United States sport, but there were two teams in Canada at that point. And I'm kind of curious as to what y'all think. This effectively killed baseball in Montreal. We can talk about that some if we want, but what impact do you think this had on baseball's growth internationally and getting out from being just an American sport? Because the Expos were added, I think, in '69, Don, that year you were talking about, and the Blue Jays about a decade later, who play in Toronto. But what are y'all's thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, one thing back to play the Expos in Montreal, we established they were probably the best team in baseball at the time. They were 11th in the National League in attendance.
Yeah.
So that, here they are, they're winning at an astounding rate, but they're still not really drawing fans. And there's some reasons for that. A lot of it, I think, too, was their stadium, but also in some past history and kind of getting our head of ourselves. But that's why I think they're looking, a good postseason run and possibly a World Series win. I guarantee you they wouldn't have been 11th in attendance the next year, even playing in an Olympic Stadium.
Right.
Yeah, although what is interesting the next year, is what often happens in a lot of sports when you have a lot of talent and you have limited resources, you have to start making decisions about who stays and who goes.
Yeah.
And in fact, that 1995 Expo team, not coming off of a World Series win and not the benefits of what they would have derived from hopefully, greater attendance, they almost immediately have to start breaking the team up. And so the team goes from this nucleus of very good young players. We mentioned Martinez being the pitcher there, that's probably well known, but a lot of other very good players on that team. You mentioned 5 all-stars that were on that
Larry
team.
Walker was on that team.
Larry Walker, who would be a future Hall of Fame and Canadian, by the way, even more reason to keep him home. The young Moises Alou, this is a 27-year-old Moises Alou, who is a
Marquise Grissom, very good fielder. Yeah.
Sean Berry, future Astro, killer bee there. But not just a good hitting team, a team that had good pitching. Obviously, we mentioned a very young Pedro Martinez, but Martinez was not the ace of that staff, arguably. Mm-hmm. You might argue that Ken Hill was the ace of that staff. Yeah. Who's sort of in his prime. He's a 28-year-old pitcher. That's sort of in the wheelhouse for when a lot of players.
They had a guy in the bullpen that was pretty good.
What was his name?
Wetland.
And to me, that's also part of what's representative about what happens here is where Wetland's going to end up. Wetland had risen to prominence as a closer for the Expos, but in the economic system of the real timeline, when things get shifted around and there are no Montreal Expos, he's going to end up being a Yankee.
The Expos were the first. They were first in the National League in ERA with the fewest walks, and third in the National League with strikeouts. They were also the youngest team in baseball at the time, 26.2 years. So, I mean, it looked like, if you're a Expo fan, you're like, we're going to be good for a long time. And then, and then all of a sudden you're not, because you listen.
If I can throw in some quick
Ryan, go ahead.
sabermetric stuff to back that up. First in ERA in the NL, and also second in FIP, fielding independent pitching. So they were legit. And then talking about their offense, they were either the 3rd or 4th best offense in the National League, whether you look at WOBA or WRC plus. So their pitching was really what carried them, but they had a very good offense as well.
And that stadium was not an offensive friendly stadium by any stretch.
No, it was like that. Yeah. And I know Don Shelley will know about this. Ryan, you may not be familiar with this, but they also led the National League in something called stolen bases. Teams actually could steal bases back then, and it was legal. I'm not sure you're not.
For those of you that have only seen baseball in the last 15 years, that's when a runner of his own fruition chooses to go from one base to another without the benefit of the ball being put in play, causing that to happen. Used to happen a lot in baseball, especially in the National League.
Yes. Yeah.
But less so. Yeah. And to me, one of the interesting what if here is, part of what you have to decide to see what the change would have been is thinking about what would have caused the strike not to happen. Well, the logical thing is they would have come to some type of agreement on how to avoid the strike. So there would have been an economic system that was acceptable to enough of the parties to say yes to it.
Right.
And the assumption would be that for that to work from the owner's perspective, there would have had to have been some form of what eventually would come in the actual settlement, which was a form of revenue sharing that would come along. And so the first thing that I throw out there is the real timeline is that the Expos don't survive in Montreal for much longer. They try to get, you mentioned part of the reason for their attendance, Kenny, from what I understand, the ballpark was not in the best part of town to be in. It didn't have a lot of other things. It was detached. And this was Olympic Stadium. This was something that had been built for the 1976 Olympic Games that they had then converted into being able to host Canadian football. That's a whole other thing we don't even want to get into. But been converted into a baseball park. A modern analogy to that, again, fairly recent, is Atlanta did the same thing and then has now gone away from it. They converted their Olympic Stadium from 1996 into a ballpark, but it was not designed for baseball in the same way that a lot of custom-built baseball stadiums have been over the last 25 and 30 years. And this is also shortly after the era of the non-multi-purpose stadium. But, we have Oriole Park, Camden Yards, Baltimore, with this throwback kind of thing. There's other stadiums that are being built and opening. The new stadium you mentioned, Colorado has come into the league, so they built this stadium eventually in Colorado that's going to be more custom built. So the economics of baseball are changing around the stadiums, and the Expos are not in step with that for a lot of reasons.
Right.
And
Well,
I know,
and
Don, you can relate. You can relate to going from the Astrodome to Minute Maid Park. How different it can be, and how much more enjoyable it can be. Just the ballpark can make your experience enjoyable. The way I understand it, Olympic Stadium is even worse than the Astrodome as far as being far away from the play, and it didn't help.
You know, it didn't lend itself to being. It was not designed as a baseball stadium, and the argument that can be made is that Montreal was not naturally a baseball town.
Yeah.
And so you put it, even though it's a successful team in a place where it's not they play this other sport in Canada. I've heard about it. It favors a particular season. I think they even had success in Montreal with what they did with this. It's
hurling.
It's not ringing a bell.
Is it hurling?
I don't think it's hurling, but it begins with an H. It's something like that. The argument being made that things were sort of already stacked against Montreal as a baseball city, and then you add a not a good stadium and the economic situation. Even if, as I recall, one of the other things that's going on here, again, talk about the historical what if, we can stay on the what did. This is one of those tricky episodes where it's hard to get away from it, is that assuming you get some form of revenue sharing, Montreal is still disadvantaged because it's Canadian dollars versus US dollars and taxation and how all this works. This is something that later comes to be, well, I guess still exists to some degree in baseball today, with free agents considering going to the one Canadian destination that's left. In that case is Toronto. You have to account for the taxation differential between the games that you play in Canada versus the United States and how your salary works. So, you know, the historical what if may be around the fact that, okay, there is this labor settlement. There's going to be more of a leveling of the economic playing field that gives Montreal a chance. And they do later try to actually get a downtown stadium. I think Labatt, the beer company, was going to be the sponsor for that. And they just never get the momentum to do that. And eventually it reaches the point where not only is the team is sold, but before the team is sold, there's even discussion of doing something really weird, which is totally eliminating the team. We're just going to contract, which is, you know, just really strange. Most sports leagues do not, by definition, contract. They relocate. They relocate, they expand. I mean, baseball is rife with relocation. Other sports are rife with relocation. But in this case, they were actually looking at potentially contracting the Expos before they get sold. Then eventually they land up at all places in a city in the United States that has failed four times before this to have the success of a franchise that sticks. I'm talking about the Washington, D.C. area.
Right.
So if the Expos are able to stay, which is a big if, and let's say they are able to win the World Series that year, Kenny, you're arguing they probably have a chance maybe of holding that team together because the fandom increases. There's some other things.
Right. And I think they're going to lose some just because it's not like, I think Larry Walker, they lost him as a free agent. Well, maybe they can't retain him. But maybe they don't have to trade, you know, Wetland, Grissom, Hill, and all these guys. They say they traded all three of them in the span of 2 days because they were needing money, and you know, it was just the revenue. Well, maybe because of their success, they don't have to do that. Right. They can hold on to some of their young guys, and just it's not just a, you know, a fire sale, so to speak, and so. And then if they start out and they're fairly successful to start the 95 season and going on their momentum, drawing well, then that builds momentum to get a new stadium built. And who knows? I think they got an excellent chance of staying.
Especially when you think about what happened with the Seattle Mariners the very next year. Yeah. You know, Seattle had lost a team before. Don, you talk about I think it was in '69 when the Pilots came into the league, and then a year later became the Brewers in Milwaukee.
Right.
But that magical 95 playoff run with the Mariners against the Yankees, which featured John Wetland, was instrumental in not only keeping baseball in Seattle because you had an exciting winning playoff team, but also helping them get a new stadium as well.
In fact, so much of the 90s in baseball becomes about, you know, to understand the stadium rush in the 90s, you have to understand what was happening with stadiums in the 60s and the 70s. Where you have the rise of, I mean, I remember growing up as a kid, three stadiums that were in the National League that if you didn't notice who was on the field and what uniform they were in, I don't think you could have told the difference between Three Rivers, Riverfront, and Veterans Stadium.
Yeah.
You know, with because they were all that same cookie cutter, round, multi-use football, baseball, multi-purpose thing, because that was the thing for municipalities to build in the 60s and 70s. It was stretching the public dollar as far as you could, right?
Right. And you left up AstroTurf.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. Which, by the way, related to the speed in the game. And even the Astrodome, which was unique because it had a roof, was that type of stadium just with a roof.
You know, and that's, like I say, the changing of the stadiums, I think then when the owners figured out that could actually be a selling point, and not just a place for people to go to see the team, but people to go to experience the stadiums. And I think that's been a major upgrade in Montreal. If they could have come out with something like that, you know, they were right there when those stadiums were starting to be built and come up. So, you know, built a really neat looking stadium, and, you know, to honor their heritage, or however they would want to do it, but just, you know, that people would really want to go and give it people, because you got to, especially if you're medium to small market teams, you got to sometimes give people a reason to go when the team's not great, because you're going to have those moments. So you got to have something. And I think, like I said, I think that could have been a big thing, but so that's what I see happening. That, you know, they win the World Series, they get a momentum building, they built them a nice little stadium there, and, you know, seats 40,000 people with a retractable roof, and they take off, and they you know, make the playoffs in '95, and then who knows, you know, they keep going.
You change a little bit of the deflection of the trajectory in 94 to 95. You get enough to get a new stadium. You get a new stadium. Your economics change. You can stay competitive. All the things that.
And I have a little side note on that. Then I think then the Yankees don't win the World Series in '96 because they don't get Wetland. Wetland stays in Montreal. He doesn't go to New York. So the Yankees have one less World Series, which is good for everybody.
I think that's all that we need to do in any alternate timeline, is just remove World Series wins from the Yankees, and all is good.
At least from the Steinbrenner era.
Yeah, well, no, just in general. In general, right?
Yeah.
Just in general. The other thing that was interesting to me that I wanted to go down a little bit was also talk about what was different in the sense of what also would not have happened if you don't have the strike. What was the sentiment of fans by the time you get to 95 in the real timeline, Kenny? You remember?
Yeah, it was. I mean, there were diehard fans who said they were done. Now, a lot of them didn't stick to it, but some did, and then your casual fans, or a lot of them just totally lost interest. You know, prior to the other work stoppages, at least they were able to cobble things together to where you had a championship and a World Series, the semblance of a real season. This one seemed like, wow, they ended it, and people were just, attendance was really dropping. And I mean,
I've got numbers on that I can throw in real quick.
Okay.
So in 1994, prior to the stoppage, the average attendance per game was 31,256. Okay, so over 31,000. The next year in 95, 25,000.
Wow. And 5,000 a game doesn't sound like a lot until you recognize those people are buying beers and hot dogs.
Yeah.
And things for their kids.
Jerseys
and the whole bit. And it's a 162 game season. It's 81 home dates. So you spread that out over, 5,000 people on average per home. Suddenly you've got 400,000, 500,000 people, tickets that aren't sold, the revenue that comes from that. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it is a lot. And it represents, of course, roughly a 16% drop, give or take, in terms of attendance. That's not small. Any sport that sees an over 10% contraction in its attendance at games year over year, something has happened.
And to carry on with that thread thing, because this is, I think, one of the most interesting what ifs about this situation is, so you've got fans that are upset, when they're going to games, they're booing, all this stuff, attendance is down. you've got a new commissioner in Bud Selig, and he needs to do something to save face. So what happens just a few years after this in 1998?
Yeah.
Were there home runs?
There were a few. Actually, more than a few. There were a lot. I think this is kind of what directly led to the steroid race, because you needed to get fans back into the game. You needed to have something exciting happening, some reason to get people either to tune in on TV or to come down to the park. And, that single season home run record is one of the most hallowed in baseball. It tore Roger Maris, who held the record at the time. When he broke Babe Ruth's record, it was, tearing him to pieces because of how meaningful it is to baseball fans.
Right.
And as you mentioned earlier too, Don, baseball is one of the sports, probably the sport that's most interested in its own history and has
has sacred numbers. We talked about this on our episode.
Yeah.
42 is a sacred number. It's a uniform number.
Yeah.
60 was a sacred number. That was the number of home runs that Ruth hit in that season.
Yeah. And we know too, I think from his own admission, that seeing this home run race between Sosa and McGuire in 98 is what led Bonds to do what he did, because he was already a Hall of Famer, already an MVP several times, already maybe the best player, but he wasn't getting the recognition that he felt like he deserved, and probably justly deserved for being as good as he was. And of course, then that led him to blow those out of the water. Not only the single season record, but then Hank Aaron's all-time record a few years after
Lots of
that.
things were blown up. Records the size of his head. There were all types of things that happened.
Many things.
This was actually one of the places I want to go. So Ryan sort of anticipated what was there. I do believe that one of the most interesting what ifs is if there had not been a work stoppage in 94, would there have been, part of it is you have to decide here whether you believe the owners and the commissioner turned a blind eye to what was going on with performance enhancing drugs and steroids, but they were certainly more inclined to do it because they needed the game to come back. You hear all the time the narrative of that 98 home run chase between Sosa and McGuire was that it saved baseball. It brought baseball back, brought attendance back. It brought interest back. It revitalized the game. Now, part of that was a couple of years had gone by, and I'm still ticked off, but I'm a baseball fan, so I'm going to go to games, kind of thing. I think that also set in to a degree, but it gave casual fans a reason to tune in and to care. And to me, the interesting perverse incentive there, which is why I think the what if is interesting. Think about what the labor stoppage was about. It's about owners not wanting to pay players more than they have to. So you want good players, but you don't want an inflated player market that causes your salaries to spiral upwards uncontrollably, which is what happened in the steroid era, because now you had to pay shortstops who were hitting 35 home runs a year when that was unheard of. You had to pay them 35 home run money, for a season versus, what you paid them for before. And I do believe if you had not have the owners going, we're desperate to put, butts in seats and get ratings on TV, I think you would have owners going, wait a second, we're not going to let people get away with this. This is costing me money because it's inflating the price of the game for me as the person who has to pay for these folks.
I think one thing too about, I don't want to seem like I'm defending the owners because they're all pretty anyway. But for the owners, when once the steroid era started, and I definitely think they turned a blind eye to it. I mean, the steroid era didn't start in 95. It started in the early 80s. But it was full blown after that. And it was everybody. And it was like saying, guys who had never hit 10 home runs in the minors were hitting 40 and 50 home runs in the majors. But the union wasn't going to go along with it either. And I think to get it back under control, get testing, which is what they needed, they would have got the union on board, which may have led to another work stoppage. I don't know, or at least having the owners give. Of course, the union would say, "Well, just have them give in on some of the other stuff, and then we'll give them we'll let them do the testing." I think, but I do think it was obvious to everybody what was happening, and they just, everybody pretended it wasn't there, including the clubs, the media. Oh my gosh, how long was it before anybody did a story? The story of Mark McGuire when they found that Andro whatever in his locker. I think it was here in Houston, and there was, he said, yeah, there's some supplements he takes, and that was kind of it. And it wasn't until later, like years later, that it came out and said, wow, that's what's going on. So the media even turned a blind eye to it. And a lot of it's because they were happy to see baseball back and doing something. And you're seeing this thing you feel like is special, and then it's kind of bad later when you find out, well, maybe it was a false special.
Yeah. One of the interesting, again, the long-term what ifs of this is legitimately, for those of us that follow baseball history, from the writer's ballot, the traditional way of getting into the Hall of Fame, there's a decent chance that when the results are announced, which is coming up here fairly shortly on the calendar, there will be nobody elected to the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame to be inducted in 2022. And it's not because when you look at the numbers and the caliber of players that are eligible on the ballot, there's plenty of them that you look at and go, that guy is Hall of Fame worthy. But the reason they're not being elected is, well, why?
Right.
Yeah.
There's a question about how they achieve those numbers, performance enhancing drugs.
Right.
You mentioned Barry Bonds. There's a pitcher of some renown, a guy comes from the Houston area, a guy by the name of Clemens, who's there. That has all the steroid era, as we call it. And again, Kenny, you're right. It didn't start in 1995. But it was allowed to, I think, to explode as a result of the needing something to bring fans back from the 94 work stoppage.
If you'll pardon the pun on this, it was a steroid era on steroids.
Yeah, exactly. And with it was the Wild West of what was allowed,
Yeah.
But the impact of that was not just baseball in the 90s and how it changed. For example, why did stolen bases go away? Why run the risk of getting thrown out at second base when you got a 70% chance of success, when the guy that's at the plate is just as likely to hit a home run, you're going to score anyway.
Yeah.
And so, it altered the way the game was played in terms of the actual strategy on the field. The ballparks, these new ballparks were a little more hitter friendly in some ways. They were more confined because they were intended to bring the fans closer than the big cavernous Olympic Stadium, type of scenarios. But I think you can argue that baseball, there's a long shadow from the steroid era that still plays itself down to 2021 and 2022, where we are today. Baseball is still in a what's the word I'm looking for? In a respect aspect, and in a I don't even know what the better word to use to describe it is, but a integrity aspect is still trying to recover from that. They were recovering from the loss of revenue in 94. Now they're recovering from trying to restore integrity.
Yeah.
And this may be a good time too to talk about a certain player in 1994. As a third baseman on the Giants by the name of Matt Williams. And you may recall he hit, was it 43 home runs?
43, yeah.
By the time of the stoppage, which then if you take how many games he had played and extrapolate, his total to how many he had left, he would have ended up with 62 home runs, which would have beaten the standing record of 61 in a season. And, there's also some discussion about whether he used steroids at any point, because he was named in the Mitchell report, and whether he was using them in 94 or not. But that's something else also interesting to think about is, well, the home run race and breaking the single season home run record of 61 invigorated fans into baseball. That could have happened in 1994 as well. This was such a banner year for so many people. We haven't even gotten to Tony Gwynn yet. But, you had this small market team from Canada that was going to be the best team in baseball. But you also may have had this third baseman in San Francisco, which I also think was not a hitter's park.
They were playing in Candlestick at the time, which was not exactly the most conducive place to play. Yeah.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
Watch a game.
Yeah, exactly.
And he may have broken Roger Maris's record of 61 home runs.
Yeah. And you mentioned two other things there. You mentioned Gwynn, the late Tony Gwynn, which is still something that I struggle to say because watched him play and, from all my life, I remember Tony Gwynn. But one of the other mystical numbers in baseball is 400. Hitting 400 a season, which means that 40% of the time or more when you come to the plate, you're successful. And Gwynn had a legitimate shot that year. He was, I think, hitting 392 at the time of the strike, or 394.
394.
Yeah.
And to put that in perspective, 394 is rare air.
Yeah.
Without even getting to 400. But to be in the middle to now late August with still a shot at hitting 400, nobody had done that since 1941.
Ted Williams.
Which was Ted Williams hitting 406.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have the chance for two very significant single season accomplishments in baseball to both be felled in the same year of 1994. Yeah. While, like you say, you've got this sort of almost feel good story, this young Canadian small market team who's, put it together through their farm system and they've done it the right way. And, sort of telling that story. The narrative for the 1994 season, if it were told, if the book were finished, if it just didn't stop, pretty compelling.
Yeah. And this is where I think it gets to a larger impact also, because in this day, MLB is still struggling to market its product well, because the NFL and the NBA have siphoned off so many fans that could have been baseball fans and have a much larger share of the sports market, I think, than MLB does. And you have to imagine that if things had gone the way that we look at it from 1994 with this wonderful David and Goliath story, if the Expos beat the Yankees in the World Series, with somebody hitting 400 in a season, breaking the single season home run record, expanding internationally with, as we mentioned, a Canadian team doing so well, that baseball continues to maintain its hold over American sports, that it continues to be the sport, the national pastime, the thing that the common man talks about. And is sort of that monolithic presence that everyone can talk about, that relates to, that has as a part of their day in, day out life. Because as we know now, that is definitely not the case.
Right. And, the other thing is there again, not knowing exactly what the settlement would have been that would have averted the labor strife, but assuming it's something that is, I'll just call it equitable. When millionaires are fighting with billionaires, it's hard to know what constitutes equity there, but something that would have been more equitable or stable, or even sustainable.
Right. I always like the idea of having a kind of a hard cap, but having a bottom as well. I think you can't revenue share. You can't have the big markets paying a luxury tax going to the smaller markets, and then have the smaller markets just keep the money. They forcing them to reinvest it back into their teams, and I don't know why something like that never went, but so I guess the players probably didn't like it. So, but.
And so if you look at, what you're just talking about there, Ryan, with the individual stories, again, the narrative of 94 would have been the narrative. Which narrative would have been the narrative of 94? David beats Goliath, Gwynn eclipses Williams, Williams eclipses Roof. What's the, what's the narrative? Oh yeah, this thing of expanding the playoffs to 4 teams from each league worked. Maybe part of what would have been in that settlement is, we'll look for a way to expand that out to we could go to 10, maybe we can go to 12 sooner. Mm-hmm. So now you have more clubs that have the opportunity to compete for the postseason, which changes the dynamics. The economics are a little better balanced. By the way, so much of this is driven by TV money, which was also disrupted. The television contract that came post-strike was different than the television contract. Yeah. And so,
is this what we have to blame for Joe Buck? Is this where it all started?
It could be. This is, it's the butterfly effect gets us Joe Buck. We probably get Joe Buck either way. You probably can't get away from it. Thanks to thanks
Have
to
to
his
talk to
dad
Dr.
being
Strange
Jack
about
Buck.
that.
Yeah, exactly. There's 14 million, was it 14 million, 14 billion different things that he works through. But again, the historical what if here is you have the 94 narrative that leads to whatever the 95 narrative would be, and the things going on from there. Maybe you don't have some of the steroids are probably going to be the performance enhancing drugs are probably going to rear up at some point.
Right.
But would it have been as rampant? Maybe there is, as Kenny just suggested, that becomes something that gets on the table, and the players and the owners both agree it's good to put a halt to this, and or to limit it or to test it or whatever. And so you change the trajectory there. And to your point, Ryan, baseball is almost a niche sport now in the United States,
Yeah.
which is hard to imagine with me growing up with it being, what it is, and it being what it is in my life and has been historically. I never would have imagined that in 1993 that it was going to become that, so if you have a different trajectory, does it become that? I think that's a good question to ask and a good thing to think about.
So Ryan, in your scenario, Tony Gwynn hits 402 and Williams hits 62 home runs. Which one of them wins the NL MVP?
Ooh.
Because we know Jeff Bagwell's not going to win it.
Yeah,
he may be the only person in America who is glad to see the strike.
I think Bagwell never wins an MVP if he doesn't win the strike short 94 MVP.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I got some numbers here on him though, and I just want to go over some of these. At the time, and this is in all of baseball, he was first in WAR by position. He was first in offensive WAR. He was first in total bases. He was first in RBIs. He was first in slugging. He was second in batting average, although 30 points behind Gwynn. He was third in home runs. He was fourth in on base percentage. He was third in runs scored, and he was second in OPS.
Yeah.
And didn't win an MVP.
That also too highlights how crazy Tony Gwynn was, because Bagwell was hitting 368, and that is incredible. Nobody hits 368. I mean, if somebody did that now, that would be remarkable.
Yeah, for instance, he was only 4 home runs behind Williams. Williams had 43 and Bagwell had 39. So, he's closer, but he's not even, on the same page.
Right.
But I definitely, there's no, and I didn't realize till I was looking, he broke his hand on August 10th, and I think the strikes was August 11th.
Yeah.
So, a lot of baseball fans may not even realize he broke his hand if you're not an Astro fan.
Right. Yeah. To answer that question, I did look into that a bit about the National League MVP. So Matt Williams ended up second. Bagwell was unanimous in first place, but Matt Williams was second. He also won a Gold Glove and a Silver Slugger award. So I think with those awards and that he ended up second, I think he probably would have been the winner if he had gotten to 62 home runs. But otherwise, I mean, as always, Bonds was a great candidate too. He ended up fourth in MVP voting. He won a Gold Glove and a Silver Slugger. So that could have been another trophy on his mantle. But who knows? But yeah, that's certainly something we could say would be a fact. Is I don't think there's any way Bagwell wins unless these other players befell injuries as well. But
the other thing that would have worked against Gwynn, the Padres were abysmal that year, with the exception of Gwynn. They were 47 and 70 at the time of the strike. The Giants were under 500, but were second in the abysmal National League West, the new National League West.
Only 3.5 back. So
so there's a possibility they could have caught fire down the stretch, particularly if Williams continued to do what he was doing, and they might have found their way into the playoffs. Not that the playoffs count towards the MVP voting, but we know that it matters. Unless it's 1987 and you're Andre Dawson in Chicago, that it doesn't matter. But I think that, for those of us that are baseball, I know we've lost our non-baseball fans at this point, but that's fine. We gave them the pass a long time ago. That, an argument can be made, again, now bringing this really close to home. Bagwell eventually got into the Hall of Fame, but he was not ushered into the Hall on first ballot, had to go through the grinded out process of making the Hall. That was with an MVP feather in his cap.
Yeah.
You know, what if Bagwell doesn't have the 94 MVP? Are we still having the argument whether Jeff Bagwell deserves to be in the Hall of Fame, but has never been given that recognition? I think it's possible. That was that was part of his resume. It's an odd way that made his resume, but it was part of his resume nonetheless.
Yeah. Bagwell's problem, if you want to call it that, is that, I mean, his power was his calling card, but he did so many things well, but didn't have that one thing. You know, he didn't get the 500 home runs or the 3,000 hits, or, you know, hundreds and hundreds of stolen bases. But he did have over 200 stolen bases and over 2,000 hits and other things. So I don't know if he would have hung on the ballot long enough for some of the younger voters that tend to value those other assets highly, for them to vote him in. So I don't know. I would think
it would have given some ammunition to the anti-Bagwell faction, because of his baseball card, his look, and you know, there's nothing definitive, but he was in the era, and there's some people that didn't want to vote for him, and not having an MVP would just been something they could have said, well, you know, he never won an MVP, so
one more
Yeah.
One more quick player I want to talk about, who I think was cost a Hall of Fame selection by the strike, was Fred McGriff. And this is getting down in the weeds a little bit for sure, so I'll be brief. But he ended his career with 493 home runs. He averaged, you know, 20 or 30 a season. He's sometimes a little more than 30. But he almost certainly would have ended his career with over 500 home runs, over 2,500 hits, and about 1,600 RBIs. And every player with 500 home runs that's not linked to steroids, which McGriff never was, is in the Hall of Fame.
Right.
And I think especially with 500 home runs and those other stats I brought up, he's a log virtually. But the strike cost him, I mean, how many games did they miss overall? It was about 70 or so?
They missed around 50 games, and then you had the delayed start of the following year, so the argument can be made, you know, that it wasn't your normal season with the normal spring training and the way things that would normally come together.
Right.
So I think you can make the to your point, and you know, again, I know again we've lost our non-baseball. That's fine. You know, it's
That's
okay.
why I felt okay to bring him up.
Yeah, but you know, being a Hall of Famer in baseball is a big thing.
Yeah.
And I remember watching McGriff play for a number of different teams. He was, you know, a well-respected player. He's in that category of players that are just, if they're not in the Hall of Fame, but they're just right there at that line for the reasons you're talking about. You know, 7 more dingers, 7 more homers, and it's a lot, because you don't do 500 home runs unless there's some cloud over you that prevents you from having that happen for you.
Yeah.
The 94 stroke was pretty costly for Fred McGriff.
Yeah.
Yes.
You know,
I don't know if he was in his prime. He was in his early 30s though, so certainly still capable of popping out another 7 bombs if he had 60 games or so to do it, I think.
Who was he even playing with at the time? Was he in Toronto?
I'm just looking that up now. He was actually in Atlanta.
Okay.
Atlanta. Oh, he's on the Braves.
Yeah, and he hit 34 dingers in 94.
It's a home run park there too. So that was
yeah. So I think you can. In fact, he was 8th in MVP voting that year. So I think you can make the argument. Can you argue 7 more home runs in the month and a fraction? I'd probably take.
It was 3 weeks of the next season too that they missed.
Yeah, so
but they didn't miss any games though.
Yeah, but they missed spring training in a late start.
Right.
Which if you're how old is McGriff in 95? He's a 31-year-old. You know, still a player, but a player that's about to start entering what is normally more the decline phase of your career in terms of putting up, you know, the stellar numbers there. I'm just looking at his numbers now. Man, those are steady numbers. He's just he's just a machine.
He reminds me a lot of a less good Hank Aaron, because Hank Aaron never, you know, hit 60 or 70 home runs in a season, but he hit about 30 or 40, and he played for 20 something years, and that'll do it, you know?
Yeah. So again, one of the, you know, an individual who's thought about, you know, we mentioned too already, you know, Bagwell as an individual, you know, is he in the Hall? He probably makes the Hall because of the strike, you might argue, or at least has a better shot because of the strike. And McGriff maybe misses the Hall because of the strike. Maybe that's,
Yeah.
the universe has a constant balance that it has to maintain of Hall
The
of Fame
first baseman
members.
quota.
Yeah, and so this is the universal Hall of Fame equilibrium in action.
I'm not sure Fred McGriff would be happy with that equilibrium.
Well, he might argue that he's more deserving than others are. Any other just broad thoughts you guys have? I know we wondered all. This is one of those topics I knew was going to wander all over the place, which was fine. I like doing that.
Yeah.
Any other things that have popped into your head when you were doing the research that maybe we haven't even hit on here? We talked a lot about the National League because, oh, by the way, at that time, Houston is a National League city. And so we knew there was this thing called the American League, and we followed it at a distance, and it was the Yankees and whoever else. But I don't know if there was anything in particular about the American League that year that's maybe worth taking a hit at.
No, I got one more little thing. There's kind of a little thing interesting about the Expos. So they lose all them players automatically starting in '95. Well, Grissom goes to the Atlanta in '95, wins the World Series. Wetland goes to the Yankees and wins the series in '96, and Alou goes to the Marlins and wins the series in '97. So, it's just like, if you're an Expo fan, that just had to, it's like, gosh, that's got to kill you.
Yeah. And many of those players, well, we mentioned another one there that was, he was a contributor on that 94 team and Sean Barry. He ends up coming to the Astros during their late 90s run when they're one of the incarnations of the Killer Bees.
Yeah, his 98 team probably still may be one of the better Astro teams ever.
Yeah. And so there's that the Expodus. Baseball leaves Montreal eventually as a team,
Can we call it the Expodus?
The Expodus?
Yeah, the Expodus.
Ryan, you have just named this episode. You didn't know that that's what you were doing, but you just did it. It's the Expodus. It has to be. Yeah. So baseball leaves as an institution eventually from Montreal, but baseball players leave Montreal and go elsewhere, almost immediately after the 94 season because of the impact of what's there. And that changes, as you will point out, maybe the Yankees don't win in 96. There's an argument to be made for, other scenarios on how that impacted clubs in different ways. And to me, the other thing that popped into my head is, we're talking about, baseball in Canada. It's not that baseball hadn't succeeded in Canada. They had just had back-to-back World Series champions in the form of the Toronto Blue Jays.
Yeah.
So it's not like baseball didn't work north of the border, but it wasn't working for economic reasons in 94 in Montreal. And they were representative of a lot of what actually led to the strike when you bring it around full circle. Yeah. They were the team that did what they did that year, but you could point to other teams that hadn't been able to hold things together. The Pirates of an era slightly before then. Pittsburgh, not a big market city. They had not been able to hold together a really good Pirate team that was there in the right around 1990 that had somebody's still paying Bobby Bonilla, I think now, right? The Yankees still are.
Yeah. He's Mets are still paying him.
Yeah. And Kenny, you hit up on one last thing I want to talk about this just briefly before we close things out, unless somebody has something else. But the change in the direction of the game that came as a result of the strike, the role of the commissioner, or I think that was you that brought that up. Maybe it was Ryan that brought it up. Did that alter baseball in a substantial way in your mind?
Well, yeah, because the decisions that have been made, especially in relation to the Astros, is relate things that would help the owners out specifically, not necessarily even the game or everything as a whole, because the commissioner represents the owners, and that's not what the position was intended to be. Even though he was originally hired and paid for by the owners, he was given, I think Landis was given a lifetime contract or whatever. He couldn't be fired or anything. So he could be independent to make decisions based on the good of the game without having to worry about his job. Well, that's not the current situation. And I don't know why baseball doesn't go to a situation where they have an independent council that hires a commissioner paid for half by the players and half by the owners, and give him for a set time to serve in that position, and give him the authority to make decisions and a rule what would be the best interest of baseball, not just the best interest of the owners.
Yeah, and just to be clear, Seeley becomes commissioner before the work stoppage, the strike in '94, but he's installed into the position knowing that this is looming and coming.
Right.
And so it was, in fact, you might even argue he's one of the causes of the '94 strike, in the sense of the players looking and going, we don't have what we used to have in the commissioner, somebody that we think has the best interest of the game versus the best interest of the owner.
Yeah.
And
one thing I'll add, I was listening to an interview with Bob Costas and Charlie Rose before this from 1994, after the strike had taken place. And that was the thing that Costas had mentioned, is it wasn't necessarily any of the specific details or anything in the contracts, but there had just been this very slowly building, gradual mistrust between the players and the owners. And I think the hiring of Seelig, because the owners had basically just pushed out Fay Vincent, the previous commissioner, who was impartial or more impartial. And I think the players saw this hiring of Bud Seelig as, well, now the owners just have one of their own in charge of our league now. And I think that was the straw that broke the camel's back for a lot of them.
Yeah, in fact, I was trying to look back here. When he first took the role of commissioner, didn't he still own the Brewers for a period of time? I don't think he had to immediately divest himself of his ownership interest, which was always astonishing.
Seemed like I remember something that his daughter or something was running the team while he was commissioner, but he still was something.
Yeah, and the interesting thing there too, again, talking back to what had been introduced in '94. Well, a couple of things had happened. Interleague play had been introduced, the wild card concept, and the change to the 3 divisions in each league were sort of a preemptive thing by Seelig. Hey, we're innovating the game, we're changing the game. But back to this idea of mistrust, from the player's perspective, it's but you sort of did that without us being involved in being a part of what we were doing there.
Right.
And sort of an interesting problem that gets created by that.
Yeah, because especially if you look at the perspective from the Expos players, they're finally getting this good team together, and now suddenly they're in the same division with the best team of the '90s, the Atlanta Braves. Like, they can't have been very thrilled with the way that those divisions were changed, obviously without any consulting of the players.
Yeah, I was just looking here. I needed to verify the facts. Yes, he served as acting commissioner from '92 to '98, so he still owned the team during that period of time. So yeah, he was.
Yeah.
And that we won't even get into our sour grapes about being forced by him to switch leagues and the other things that we could go to. That's a whole other historical what if that only Houstonians would probably care about, but we care about deeply.
Yeah.
So big conclusion is 1994 changed baseball as we know it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Did it change it in the real timeline for the better?
I think it could. Yes. I think the steroid era gets shut down earlier, and the small market teams do better, and because of the new agreement that we came up with, that they settled on, and I believe that baseball is healthier now than it's ever been. And that 2017 World Series legitimized.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's all. Unicorns and sunshine.
There you go.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah, I think our hypothetical imagination of what could have happened would have been the better scenario. Because with this revenue sharing, then I think you don't ever have teams tanking for several years, which I think is bad for baseball. I think it's better when everybody is competitive and trying to win actively. And then, having more fans in the game, I think would have been great, because I still, even with all the changes and everything that's been through and all the tainted events that have occurred throughout its history and even its recent history, I still think it's a great game and a beautiful game. And I know maybe a little biased. I don't know if I'm biased because I love it better or if I love it better because it's subjectively a better game. But it's chicken or egg. But I think certainly baseball would have been the better if they could have avoided the strike. Certainly.
Yeah, and so bringing the top, which is why I wanted to do the topic, because we're now back in the risk of another work stoppage.
Yeah.
And to me, the way that now history is informing the present is baseball was resilient enough, maybe for bad reasons that we've talked about, performance enhancing drugs, other things that happened, that artificially saved the game, only now to maybe doom the game a little bit more. But baseball was resilient in 94 when it went through this work stoppage. I'm not sure you can make the argument that 2022 Major League Baseball is as resilient as an institution to be able to survive another work stoppage.
Yeah.
And so that's where history comes down to the present in what we're dealing with now, in my mind.
Sometimes I question whether the self-interest of the individual teams and owners and the self-interest of the players, and they live in their own little bubble and think this thing can go on forever when it can't. It may not. It was dangerously close to being greatly reduced down. I mean, Don, like you shared earlier, baseball in the American consciousness is not where it is now. It's not where it was in 1975 or 1978.
And we talked about expansion, and there has been no expansion since 1993, since the year before the strike. And I believe since they first had expansion, I believe this is the longest we've gone before adding any additional teams. And, our country, our population continues to grow, but our quote unquote national pastime does not.
I really thought we'd have a team in Mexico by now.
Well, you actually just took the thought out of my head there, Kenny, in terms of, should it matter that a team in, it's Canada. It's not like it's another country or anything.
Yeah.
But that's actually the part of Canada that is, Toronto is a good, Toronto and Montreal to me are interesting contrasts in baseball. Just to hit this on a second. Toronto, for lack of, I know this will not make people happy. I've been to Toronto. I've never actually been to Montreal. I've been to Toronto. Toronto is a lot more like America. It's not that far removed from the United States. You can drive easily to Toronto. It's not that far away from Detroit in terms of being, real nearby. And, it sits there north of, it's close. French Canada, Quebec is a different Canada than where Toronto is.
Yeah.
And so losing a franchise in Montreal, that was a much more, I guess what I'm trying to say in a clumsy way, that was a much more international city that becomes an international franchise. It's multilingual, all the things that go with that. We know what the emblem is on the cap, but even that looks sort of goofy, in terms you have to have it explained to you why they're even called the Expos.
Yeah.
To your point, Kenny, if baseball survives there, I think baseball is much more willing to say, well, what about a team in Puerto Rico? What about a team in Mexico City? What about looking towards the next logical expansion? Because eventually we do see in the 90s, then certainly into the 2000s, Hideki Matsui, Ichiro Suzuki, some of the players that come over from Asia, maybe we actually, by this time, if baseball doesn't have that lull that it has to come back from, it's more international in this hemisphere. And maybe it's global, the World Baseball Classic will eventually come along, but maybe it globalizes itself in the sense of, the real World Series is, the Asian champions, the Japanese league or the Korean league faces off with the American. And there's reason to believe that that's not a foregone conclusion when it's played every year.
Right.
Or the Caribbean champion, as the case might be, because certainly the game has long been more Latin in its influence over the last 40, 50 years.
Yeah.
In terms of where the players are coming from, not where the teams reside.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the sport's big there.
Right.
I have no doubt in my mind they could support a team. I've always wondered why they haven't tried to go that way, but
Well, part of it is still the economics, which weren't
Yeah.
solved in '94 and still haven't been solved, in the sense of, how do you, when you have currency discrepancies and, second/third world versus first world, that team in, well, look at just Puerto Rico, just in general, just using that as a I think there's no doubt there's a fandom that would support
Right.
there, but economically, you have to have a mechanism where, by golly, the Yankees and the Dodgers are willing to give up something to build stability for a team that's going to exist there.
Yeah.
And that's long been the challenge of baseball. Now we're going philosophical here, but '94 didn't solve that. So in an alternative reality where maybe what solved the '94 thing was not a strike and then a recovery fueled by steroids, maybe it's actually resolved and you build upon that to something that evolves to a different game today.
Just on a little bit of what you was talking about, the big market teams be willing to give up. What gets me is when I've heard them say, an owner say, well, why should I give up money and give it to my competitor? In other words, give it. What he don't realize, the other baseball teams aren't his competitor. They're his colleagues, but they're partners. The competitor is the American or the Puerto Rican or whoever who's going to spend their entertainment dollars. Where are they going to spend it? Are they going to spend it at the baseball game or at the movies, or they're going to go to a football game? That's who you're competing with. Yankees aren't competing. If you're an owner, you're not competing with the Orioles they're, in other words, if you're the Yankees and you're doing really well and everybody else is falling apart, well, you can't play in the league by yourself.
Yeah.
You got to do something. Build up the other team. Yeah.
To be fair, anytime the Orioles are involved, I don't think there's much competition anymore.
Well, maybe I should use the major league team.
Yeah. Hey, there used to be a major league team in Baltimore.
Yeah.
They used to have this guy named Earl who was in charge of that. Well, and just to your point there, Kenny, is that you mentioned Costas there, Ryan. He wrote a book called Fair Ball. Around about the same time here. It's actually, I think, over my bookshelf here somewhere. And one thing to your point, Kenny, he argued about is there's already things in the game that it's not about purely the economics. The Yankees aren't allowed to have a 32-man roster while everybody else has 25,
right,
just because they can afford it.
Yeah.
The way regular business works, it does work that way.
Right.
You can take whatever advantage you want. And so, to your point, the rules of the game, the draft system, all the other things are already built around the fact that you're right. The Yankees and Astros compete on the field, but they're partners economically.
Right.
And the argument can be made that when the labor strife, which is what this is all about, is at the end of the day, are the owners and players, are they competing with each other in a labor arena, or are they partners just in a different way about dividing up, the revenue and the proceeds in such a way that the last time I checked, nobody went to our local major league stadium, which is a fantastic place to watch a baseball game. Nobody went to see the owner outside of us, who can name the owner of the Astros, right? Nobody goes to Minute Maid Park to see Jim Crane.
Yeah.
You go to see the players that comprise the current Astros team, Jose Altuve, maybe Carlos Correa, although he's probably not going to be back. But, you went for those reasons, not because of the owners. And other sports have figured this out, to be honest with you, in ways that baseball hasn't. And that is the what if of '94. I think if they'd have found maybe a different way to resolve things there, they could have built upon a different form of labor peace than has been built on today. All right, that concludes the sports philosophical portion of today's podcast. Guys, I really enjoyed, first of all, I just enjoyed talking to you guys. That's easy here. So the fact that we're doing it in a different environment makes sense. Anybody have any closing thoughts? I have to say that one last time. I'm required by law.
Nope.
All right. This episode, I enjoyed having you. This episode is going to drop on New Year's Eve. So if you're listening to the episode today from A Fork in Time, myself and Alexis and Ryan and Kenny and all the other folks that make this podcast and our other podcast, The Room Where It Happened, a plug for that there too, and for the musical from which it steals its name, is Happy New Year. I hope that you had a good 2021 and that you're poised for a fantastic 2022 when you hear this episode. And again, it's been my pleasure to talk to my friends, and you guys just happen to sit around and listen to us while we do it. So until next time, hope that you come back for the next episode. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.